the water rises up from the water table to create this island in the middle, which perhaps...
Beneath the temple of Seti I in Abydos, Egypt, archaeologists in 1914 uncovered a structure so old that the ancient Egyptians themselves had buried it under millions of tons of sand, and the men who excavated it spent the rest of their careers unable to agree on what it was, who built it, or how it was built. That structure is called the Osirion, and the deeper that scientists look into it, the less they can explain. This video will take you through everything that has been found inside it, everything that has been found beneath it, and the growing list of questions that mainstream archaeology has been unable to answer for over a century. The man who first excavated the Osirion was Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie, widely considered the father of modern scientific archaeology. Petrie was not a showman or a treasure hunter. He was the professor who invented the stratigraphic dating method, the systematic technique of reading soil layers to assign dates to buried objects, a method that still forms the backbone of archaeological practice today. He held the first chair in Egyptology at University College London, a post created specifically for him in 1892. By the time he arrived at Abydos in the early 1900s, Petrie had already excavated more than 30 sites across Egypt and Palestine, had published dozens of peer-reviewed reports, and had trained a generation of archaeologists who would go on to define the field for the next 50 years. Petrie did not work alone at Abydos. He partnered with Margaret Alice Murray, a lecturer at University College London, who would later become one of the most respected Egyptologists of the 20th century, and with Edouard Naville, a Swiss archaeologist affiliated with the Egypt Exploration Fund who had spent decades excavating temples across the Nile Delta. These were not fringe researchers, they were the establishment, and what they found at Abydos is what no one in the establishment has been able to satisfactorily explain, since the official version of the Osirion begins in a relatively straightforward place. The Temple of Seti I, built around 1279 BCE during the reign of the New Kingdom pharaoh, is one of the best preserved religious structures in Egypt. It sits in the ancient city of Abydos, which the Egyptians considered among the holiest places on earth. The city where, according to religious tradition, the head of the god Osiris was buried after Set dismembered his body. During Naville's excavations between 1914 and 1933, his team broke through the rear wall of the Seti I temple and discovered a second, entirely different structure buried behind and below it. That structure, the Osirion, appeared to be a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb built in honor of Osiris. It was not designed to hold a body, it was a ritual space. The hieroglyphs inside it referenced Osiris, the ceiling had astronomical carvings, and the style matched other religious monuments of the New Kingdom period. Egyptologists assigned it to Seti I, dated it to approximately 1290 BCE, and moved on. The Osirion was catalogued, partially excavated, partially flooded. It sits in a natural depression that fills with groundwater, and left to specialists. Case filed. That is the official version. What the stonework itself shows is something considerably harder to place in 1290 BCE. The Osirion is built from massive blocks of red Aswan granite, some of them weighing an estimated 100 tons each. These blocks are not decorated, they are not inscribed. They have been cut and fitted together with a precision that, in every other context where it appears in Egypt, is associated with the oldest known construction periods, the Old Kingdom and earlier. Compare this to the Temple of Seti I directly above it. That temple is covered in finely carved reliefs, detailed inscriptions, columns with capitals, walls layered with color and text. The Osirion has none of that. Its aesthetic is completely different from the structure it supposedly belongs to. Naville himself wrote in his 1914 excavation report that the Osirion appeared to be from a period earlier than the New Kingdom, though he stopped short of specifying how much earlier. The scale of the construction is the first thing that refuses to sit neatly inside the accepted timeline. The central hall of the Osirion consists of a rectangular island surrounded by a water channel, accessed originally by two bridges. Around the perimeter of the hall runs a series of chambers cut directly into the living rock. The walls are lined with granite blocks, some of them reportedly measuring up to 4 meters in height and 2 meters in width, placed with joints so tight that a standard sheet of paper cannot be inserted between them. Edouard Naville noted this specifically, that the joinery of the blocks showed a technical precision he had not encountered at any other New Kingdom site in Egypt. For comparison, the Great Pyramid at Giza, dated to approximately 2560 BCE, roughly 1300 years before Seti I, uses the same style of massive, undecorated, precisely fitted granite construction in its internal chambers. So does the Valley Temple of Khafre, which sits at the base of the Sphinx enclosure. Egyptologist John Anthony West spent much of his career in the 1980s and 1990s drawing attention to this stylistic parallel, arguing that the Osirion belonged not to the New Kingdom, but to what he called the pre-dynastic tradition, a period of construction that predated the first pharaoh by an unknown but potentially significant margin. West was not working alone. In 1991, he brought in Dr. Robert Schoch, a professor of geology at Boston University and a specialist in stratigraphy and rock weathering. Schoch had earned his doctorate from Yale in 1983, had published extensively in peer-reviewed journals, and had no prior association with alternative history research. His specialty was reading rock surfaces to determine the environmental conditions that had shaped them over time. What Schoch observed at the Sphinx enclosure, and what he later argued applied to the Osirion as well, was that the erosion patterns on the stone were consistent with heavy, prolonged rainfall weathering, not wind and sand weathering. In the Eastern Sahara, the last period of sustained heavy rainfall occurred not in Seti I's time, and not in the Old Kingdom. It occurred during the African humid period, which ended approximately 5,000 years before the Common Era, putting it closer to 7,000 BCE or earlier. Schoch presented his findings at the 1991 annual meeting of the Geological Society of America. The presentation drew an immediate and hostile response from Egyptologists in attendance. Dr. K. Lal Gowrie of the University of Louisville argued that the weathering patterns could be explained by capillary moisture rising through the rock from groundwater, not rainfall. Dr. Zahi Hawass, then director of the Giza pyramids and one of the most powerful figures in Egyptian antiquities management, reportedly dismissed Schoch's conclusions publicly on multiple occasions, telling journalists that no civilization capable of building such structures existed in the Nile Valley before the dynastic period. Schoch acknowledged the capillary moisture argument, but maintained that the scale and depth of the erosion channels he documented were inconsistent with capillary action alone. In his 2012 book Forgotten Civilization, co-authored with journalist Robert Boval, Schoch expanded his analysis to include geophysical survey data from the Giza Plateau. He cited a 1996 ground-penetrating radar survey conducted by a team from Waseda University in Japan that reportedly detected anomalies, cavities or chambers, beneath the bedrock of the Sphinx enclosure. The Egyptian government subsequently declined permission for further invasive investigation of those anomalies. The survey results were published in the journal Archaeological Prospection, but have not, as of the most recent publicly available record, been followed up with excavation. If you have been watching this channel and you have never come across this story before, subscribe right now, because buried history like this, the kind that sits in peer-reviewed journals and government archives but never makes it into textbooks, is exactly what we go deep on here every week. Inside the Osirion itself, there is a specific piece of evidence that has generated more debate than almost anything else connected to the structure. On the walls of a side chamber, reportedly discovered during later clearance work in the 20th century, researchers have documented a series of inscriptions that include what appears to be a complete copy of the Book of Gates, one of the most important funerary texts in ancient Egyptian religious tradition, describing the journey of the soul through the 12 hours of the night. The presence of this text is not surprising in itself. What is surprising is the position of the copy. The version inscribed in the Osirion is considered by several Egyptologists to be among the oldest known complete copies of the text. According to Dr. Eric Hornung, Professor Emeritus of Egyptology at the University of Basel and one of the foremost scholars of Egyptian religious texts, certain compositional features of the Osirion's Book of Gates inscription suggest it preserves an earlier textual tradition than many New Kingdom copies. Hornung documented this in his 1999 work, The Ancient Egyptian Books of the Afterlife. He was careful not to use this as evidence of a pre-dynastic origin for the structure itself, but the implication that the Osirion may have been a repository for textual traditions far older than Seti I has not been resolved by subsequent scholarship. There is also the matter of the structure's depth. The Osirion sits approximately 9 meters below the floor level of the Seti I temple directly above it. In standard Egyptian construction practice, a king would not deliberately bury his own cenotaph nearly 30 feet underground and then build his primary cult temple on top of it. The accepted explanation is that the builders intentionally placed the Osirion at the level of the ancient water table, symbolically connecting it to the primordial waters of creation, the Nun, which in Egyptian cosmology existed before the universe itself. That explanation is theologically coherent and well supported by textual evidence. The construction logistics, however, remain unaddressed in the official literature. Excavating 9 meters down, cutting chambers into living bedrock, and then precisely fitting 100-ton granite blocks at that depth, using New Kingdom technology, has never been demonstrated experimentally. A separate line of inquiry concerns the astronomical alignments of the Osirion. In 2011, Dr. Juan Antonio Belmonte, a researcher at the Instituto de Astrofísica de Canarias in Spain who specializes in archaeoastronomy, published a paper in the Journal for the History of Astronomy examining the orientation of multiple Egyptian temples. His analysis indicated that the central axis of the Osirion is aligned to within a fraction of a degree with the rising point of the star Thuban, which served as the North Pole star not in Seti I's era, but during a period approximately 4,000 to 5,000 years earlier, around 2750 BCE at the earliest, and potentially as far back as 3900 BCE, depending on the specific alignment calculation. Belmonte himself did not argue this proved an earlier construction date. He described it as warranting further investigation. What makes this alignment significant in context is its convergence with two other independent lines of evidence: Schoch's geological dating, which points toward a pre-dynastic or even pre-Holocene origin, and the architectural style, which matches construction traditions from Egypt's earliest recorded periods rather than its New Kingdom. None of these three lines of evidence alone would be sufficient to overturn the accepted chronology. Together, they form a cluster of anomalies that the current model does not cleanly accommodate. In 2019, a team from the Scan Pyramids project, the Egyptian-French-Japanese collaborative initiative that uses muon tomography and infrared thermography to non-invasively image the interiors of ancient structures, reportedly conducted a preliminary survey in the Abydos region. Muon tomography, for context, uses cosmic ray particles that pass through solid rock the way X-rays pass through tissue, creating images of density variations inside stone structures without excavation. The Scan Pyramids team had previously used this technique to identify a previously unknown void inside the Great Pyramid in 2017, a discovery published in Nature. Whether their Abydos survey extended to or beneath the Osirion has not been confirmed in any publicly available report as of the date of this video. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities has not released data from that survey. The flooding of the Osirion has compounded every investigative effort for the past 100 years. Because the structure sits at or near the natural water table, much of its lower section remains permanently submerged. Naville's team in the 1930s reportedly found artifacts in the submerged sections, carved stone objects and ceramic fragments, but the rising water prevented systematic documentation. The Egyptian Antiquities Organization attempted drainage efforts at various points in the 20th century, according to records held at the Egypt Exploration Society in London. But sustained access to the lowest chambers has never been achieved. This is not a minor logistical inconvenience. The most important archaeological context in any ancient structure, the floor level, is precisely what has never been fully examined at the Osirion. Whatever was placed there originally, whatever construction marks, tool traces, or foundation deposits might resolve the dating question, has been sitting under approximately 4 meters of groundwater for as long as scientific investigation has been attempted. The structure is simultaneously one of the most studied and least understood monuments in Egypt. Egyptologist Dr. Miroslav Werner, former director of the Czech Institute of Egyptology at Charles University in Prague, and author of the 1997 comprehensive survey, The Pyramids, the Mystery, Culture, and Science of Egypt's Great Monuments, addressed the Osirion briefly in a 2003 interview with the Czech academic journal Pražský egyptologický sborník. He described it as, and this is a rough translation from the Czech, a structure whose peculiarities have not yet received a satisfying explanation within the existing chronological framework. That is a notable statement from someone who spent his career defending and refining that chronological framework. The question of who the Osirion was built for and when may never be resolved without access to its submerged lower chambers, but the evidence that has been gathered above the waterline already places it in a category that no other structure in the world quite occupies, a building that is officially dated to one period, geologically argued to belong to an earlier one, astronomically aligned to a third period, and stylistically consistent with a fourth. These are not minor discrepancies. They are the kind of discrepancies that, in any other archaeological context, would trigger a comprehensive reinvestigation. The most likely explanation, in the view of the researchers who have engaged with this seriously, is that the Osirion incorporates an older core structure that was later incorporated into, adapted for, or built over by the Seti I project. This would not be unprecedented in Egyptian history. The Temple of Karnak, for example, preserves multiple layers of construction spanning nearly 2,000 years, with later pharaohs literally building on top of earlier structures. If the same thing happened at Abydos, the original core of the Osirion may predate Seti I by not decades or centuries, but potentially millennia. That conclusion, if it were ever confirmed through excavation, would not merely revise a footnote in Egyptology. It would require a fundamental rethinking of the timeline of organized human civilization in the Nile Valley. Specifically, what level of technical and organizational capacity existed there before the First Dynasty began around 3100 BCE? What is already clear, from 110 years of excavation, geological analysis, astronomical study, and architectural investigation, is that the standard answer given in every introductory Egyptology textbook, Seti I built it around 1290 BCE as a cenotaph for Osiris, does not account for the evidence. It never fully has. Here's the question that the researchers themselves have not answered, and the one that I think is worth putting to you directly. If the Osirion does preserve the remains of a pre-dynastic structure built by people whose identity and capabilities we have not yet mapped, and if the Egyptian government has declined further non-invasive imaging surveys of the site, then what specifically is the barrier to further investigation? And who decides when it ends? Leave your answer in the comments. And if the kind of buried history that official timelines leave out is what you come here for, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is what this channel covers every week.